This episode includes explicit accounts of physical torture, child abuse, murder, and the discovery of hidden bodies in a home freezer. Due to the graphic nature of abuse discussed and the presence of sensitive material, viewer discretion is strongly advised. Before we get into this story, there's something important I want to share. This channel is now dedicated to telling true crime stories for those moments when you're working late, calming down after a busy day, out for a walk, or just trying to get some rest. You'll find out that every story here is told with enough detail to keep you hooked in a style that's smooth and easy to follow. You don't have to watch the screen or concentrate on every word. You can just let the story play in the background, whether you're busy with something else or lying down ready to sleep. So, subscribe and let's get the chills together. In August of 2012, when Mitchelle Blair came home to her apartment at the Martin Luther King complex on the east side of Detroit, she saw something that stopped her right where she stood. Her youngest child, 6-year-old Matthew, was sitting on the living room floor, surrounded by his action figures. At first, it looked like he was just playing, but then she saw what he was actually doing. He was pushing one of the toys against another, making them act out sexual things. Blair, who was 35 at the time, froze. After standing there for a moment, she walked over to Matthew and bent down to him. She looked him in the eye and asked, "Why are you doing that?" Then she asked, "Did anybody ever do this to you?" At first, Matthew said no, but Blair didn't let it go. She pushed him to answer, kept questioning him, until finally Matthew said yes. Someone had done that to him. When she asked who it was, he told her it was his brother, Stephen. That answer hit her hard. Blair's mind went straight back to the pain she had lived through herself. When she was a child, she had been sexually abused. She had tried to tell her mother about it, but her mother hadn't shown any sympathy. She had only said, "What do you want me to do about it? It's over with now." The pain of that moment had stayed with Blair all her life. She had warned her own children again and again that rape was the worst thing anyone could ever do. And now she believed it was happening inside her own home. This time, she was not going to ignore it. She turned and started walking toward the stairs. Stephen was upstairs in the bedroom he shared with Matthew. He was quiet, small for 9 years old, and often kept to himself. Blair climbed the stairs with anger growing louder in her head with every step. When she reached the top, she went straight into his room. There was no hesitation in her voice when she confronted him. "Matthew said you were humping on him. Is that true?" she asked. Stephen looked back at her. According to what Blair later said, he admitted it. He said yes. The second he said that, she began hitting him. She punched him in the face and body again and again. Stephen tried to shield himself, but he was a child, small against an adult's strength, and there was nothing he could do to stop her. Downstairs, Gabrielle heard what was happening. The sound of her mother's voice, the thuds, the crying, it was familiar. She knew exactly what was going on. This wasn't the first time she had heard her mother beating one of them, but something about this was worse. It didn't stop. Blair didn't calm down after that night. Over the next 2 weeks, what she did to Stephen went far beyond a beating. She tortured him, and she made sure her other children saw it. Blair decided that Stephen had to suffer because in her mind, what he had done couldn't be forgiven. She told Gabrielle and Matthew that their brother was a rapist and that he deserved whatever happened next. From that moment on, everything she did was meant to punish him. She began by taking away his food. Matthew had once told her that Stephen stole meat from his plate, so Blair said Stephen wouldn't be eating meat anymore. For 2 weeks, all he got was vegetables and one small bowl of oatmeal a day. He was already a small boy, and with almost nothing to eat, his body started to weaken and shrink. Blair made him stand in the bathtub while she ran hot water and filled containers straight from the tap. Without warning, she threw the scalding water over his genitals and his legs. The heat was so strong that blisters rose on his skin and peeled away almost instantly. Stephen screamed in pain, but she didn't stop. She did it again and again. Matthew had also told her that Stephen once made him drink the blue stuff under the sink, meaning Windex, the cleaner. Blair decided to turn that around on him. She forced Stephen to drink Windex herself, pouring it into his mouth as he gagged and choked. Then she took a thick leather belt, wrapped it tightly around his neck, and pulled until his feet lifted off the ground. She kept pulling until he passed out. When his body went limp, she waited for him to wake, then asked, "Do you like how this feels, choked with a belt?" Once he opened his eyes, she did it all over again. Sometimes she covered his face with plastic bags, pressing them down over his nose and mouth. He clawed at the plastic to breathe, tearing through the first one. So Blair found heavier ones, put them over his head again, and held them tight until he passed out. When he came to, she slapped him awake. Gabrielle and Matthew were often forced to stand there and watch. Blair wanted them to see. She wanted them to understand that this, in her view, was punishment for rape. She called it justice and made them believe it. Over time, Stephen became quiet. He didn't talk anymore. He didn't fight back. His body was covered in burns, bruises, and welts. He vomited often, barely had any food or water, and his body was shutting down. He was dying right in front of them. On August 30th, 2012, Blair went to check on him. Stephen was lying on the floor, not moving, with vomit beside his body. She tried to shake him awake, but he didn't respond. He was dead. Blair didn't call the police or an ambulance. She didn't scream or collapse. She just stood there and made a decision. She went to his bed, took one of his favorite blankets, and wrapped his body in it carefully. Then she carried him downstairs to the living room where there was a white deep freezer next to the front door. She opened the lid, placed Stephen's small body inside, adjusted him so he fit, and closed the lid. Gabrielle and Matthew stood nearby, watching everything. Their brother was gone, and their mother had just put him into the freezer. Blair told them not to talk about it. She told them Stephen had gotten what he deserved, and that it was finished. But it was. Life inside that apartment went on, as though nothing had happened. The white deep freezer stayed in its place by the front door, humming quietly, while Stephen's body lay frozen inside. Gabrielle walked past it each morning on her way to the kitchen. Matthew walked past it too, heading toward his toys. Blair walked by it again and again through the day, without ever looking toward it or speaking of what was there. It became part of the room, silent but impossible to forget. When anyone asked about Stephen, Blair already had her answer ready. She told neighbors that he was staying with his maternal great-aunt, Angela Gordon. She said it calmly, without hesitation, and no one doubted her. Even Stephen's father, Stephen Barry, believed it when he called to ask where his sons were. Blair told him the same story, that Stephen was visiting his great-aunt. Barry hadn't seen his children since April of 2012, about 4 months before Stephen died. He owed over $12,000 in child support at that point and didn't press for details. He simply accepted what Blair said and hung up. When Stoney's father, Alexander Dorsey, reached out about his daughters, Blair gave him the exact same story. She said the girls were staying with the aunt. Dorsey hadn't seen his children for 2 years and owed $39,000 in back child support. Like Barry, he didn't ask questions. A year after Stephen's death, in 2013, Blair removed all of her children from school completely. She told the school she planned to homeschool them. In Michigan, parents were not required to register or show proof of any homeschooling program, so there was no follow-up from school officials. No one from the education department ever checked in. The children's names simply dropped from the school system, and nobody noticed. By then, Gabrielle was 17 years old, and Matthew was 7. Both spent nearly all their time inside that apartment. Neighbors rarely saw them outdoors. When they did catch a glimpse, the two looked quiet and withdrawn. One neighbor, 28-year-old Jessie Porter, said she never saw much of the children, but had believed Blair was a dedicated mother who loved them and homeschooled them herself. Porter even said that Blair had superglued their schoolwork to the walls. Inside the house, however, the violence kept going. Blair regularly beat Gabrielle with extension cords and wooden planks. She pressed a hot curling iron to her skin and once hit her so hard in the mouth that one of her front teeth broke. Another time, she burned Gabrielle's back with a clothing iron and poured rubbing alcohol directly onto the burns. Gabrielle's body carried scars from head to toe, some old and faded, others raw and fresh. Matthew was also marked by the same kind of abuse. His back was covered in scars, 25 in total, with a mix of healed and recent wounds. The marks were shaped in loops, consistent with being struck by a cord. At the same time, Blair continued receiving welfare benefits meant for all 4 children, including Stephen, who by then had been dead for months. She collected $771 each month in food assistance and Medicaid, and no agency ever checked to confirm whether the children were even still alive. Child Protective Services had been to Blair's home years earlier. The first visit was in September of 2002, and the second in February of 2005. Both times, investigators confirmed reports of physical abuse and neglect. Blair had been been referred to several counseling and service programs afterward. Families First, CBC Counseling Services, Eastwood Clinic for both family and individual therapy, psychological evaluations, and Work First programs. But none of that changed the outcome. Blair kept custody of her children. The system had identified her as an abusive parent, verified the claims against her, and left the children in her care anyway. By 2013, 9 months after Stephen's death, Blair's anger had shifted. This time, it settled on Stoney. In May of that year, Blair said she found out something new, something she believed meant Stoney had to be punished too. She claimed that Stoney had been sexually abusing Matthew. When Blair asked Matthew if it was true, he said no. She didn't stop. She asked him again and again until her voice turned into a threat. She told him he would be beaten if he didn't tell her the truth. Eventually, Matthew said yes. He told her Stoney had done it too. Blair decided that Stoney had to die. Her violence toward Stoney was not something that built out of control. It was intentional from the start. Unlike what she later said about Stephen, claiming his death had been an accident, she admitted from the beginning that when it came to Stoney, she had meant to kill her. She began by starving her, giving her almost nothing to eat, watching her daughter's body grow weaker each day. Stoney was already thin, but as the days passed, her arms, legs, and face began to look skeletal. The starvation was only part of it. Blair beat her every chance she got. She hit her in the face again and again. She said herself that she punched her a lot. Sometimes she used her fists. Other times she picked up a 2x4 piece of wood and swung it with full force at Stoney's body. The blows landed on her head, her back, her tailbone. The repeated strikes caused a fracture in Stoney's skull. Blair also made her stand in the bathtub, completely naked, while she filled containers with scalding water and threw them onto her. The water hit her skin and burned through it. Blair then called Matthew into the bathroom, ordering him to tell Stoney what she had supposedly done to him. He stood there, repeating what his mother wanted to hear. Every time he spoke, Blair hit Stoney harder. She didn't stop there. Blair pressed a hot curling iron against Stoney's body and later took a clothing iron, heating it up before burning her skin with it. The smell, the screams, none of it made her stop. On May 25th, 2013, things came to their final point. Blair told Stoney that she hated her. According to what the state later filed, Stoney had said she didn't like her siblings, Gabrielle or Matthew. The moment Blair heard that, she snapped. She grabbed a black t-shirt, wrapped it around Stoney's neck, and began to pull. Stoney fought for air, struggled to get free, but Blair held the shirt tighter until her daughter stopped moving. Even then, she didn't stop. She took a plastic garbage bag and pulled it down over Stoney's head, covering her nose and mouth, holding it there until her body went limp. Stoney was 13 years old when she died. When it was over, Blair called Gabrielle into the room. Her oldest daughter walked in and saw her sister lying motionless on the floor. Blair ordered her to help. Together, they wrapped Stoney's body in plastic, sealing it tightly. Then Blair told Gabrielle to carry her. They went downstairs, step by step, to the living room where the white deep freezer stood humming in its usual place. Blair lifted the lid. Inside, Stephen's body had been frozen for 9 months, still wrapped in his blanket. Blair and Gabrielle placed Stoney's plastic-wrapped body on top of his, the sound of the plastic crinkling as they arranged her inside. Blair then closed the lid. Now both Stoney and Stephen were in that freezer. Gabrielle knew it. Matthew knew it. And Blair told them both never to speak about it. She said to keep quiet. Later, Blair told investigators that after killing Stoney, there had been a moment when she considered turning herself in. She said she'd asked Matthew what he thought she should do. He told her he didn't want her to leave or go to jail because he didn't want to live without her. So Blair decided to stay. And the freezer, with both of her children inside, stayed closed. For almost 2 years, Mitchelle Blair lived in that same apartment with Gabrielle and Matthew, while the freezer that held Stephen and Stoney's bodies sat in plain sight just a few feet from the front door. There was no attempt to hide it. It was right there in the middle of the living room, always humming, always there. Every day, Gabrielle had to walk past it. Later, she said, I was afraid to even walk by the freezer. Every time I came downstairs to eat breakfast or to play a video game, I had to walk right past the freezer. But there was nowhere else that my mom could hide the bodies. They were cooped up in a freezer like meat. Each time she went downstairs, the sight of that freezer reminded her what was inside it, what her mother had done, and what might happen to her next. Gabrielle lived day and night in fear that she would be next. Blair kept beating her with cords and wooden planks, and sometimes burned her with hot irons, the marks staying on her skin long after. Every scar she had was a mark of what life in that apartment had become. She didn't go to school. She couldn't tell anyone. She lived like a prisoner, trapped and terrified. Matthew, who was around 8 by then, understood everything too. He knew his brother and sister were dead, that his mother had killed them, and that if he ever talked, she could kill him too. Blair beat him as well, using extension cords that left his back lined with loop-shaped scars. The children never spoke about the freezer, but they didn't have to. Its presence said everything. Outside that apartment, Blair managed to keep up appearances. Any time someone asked where the other children were, she gave the same story. She said they were staying with their great-aunt. When their fathers called to ask, she told them the same thing. Nobody pressed for details. Nobody came by to check. Nobody reported anything strange to police. Meanwhile, the state continued to send Blair money every month as if nothing had changed. She kept collecting $771 in food assistance, plus Medicaid for all 4 children, including Stephen and Stoney, who had already been dead for years. The payments came regularly. Nobody checked to confirm if the children were still alive. Blair had no job and was falling deeper into debt. Rent payments stopped. Family members who used to help her financially told her to get a job or go back to school, but she ignored them. The rent stayed unpaid. She was sued repeatedly by the Martin Luther King Apartments management 6 different times between 2004 and 2015. for not paying rent. Each time the complex took her to court, and each time she still fell behind again. By February of 2015, she owed $2,354.50. An eviction order was finally filed on February 11th, 2015, and by March 9th, a judgment by consent was entered, giving her more time to either pay up or move out. She did neither. On March 24th, 2015, the court sent bailiffs to apartment 804 on Saint Aubin Street to carry out the eviction. Blair wasn't there when they arrived. She had gone to stay with her sister, Lanier, who lived in another unit in the same complex. That morning, she had called Lanier and said, "If you don't never see me again, just know that I love you." Around 11:30 that morning, the eviction crew reached her apartment. They knocked several times, identified themselves, and when there was no answer, they went inside. The apartment was filthy. There was trash piled in corners. The air was thick with a foul smell, and it was clear no one had been taking care of the place. None of the children were there, and neither was Blair. The crew started clearing out furniture and other belongings so they could empty the apartment. Then one of them noticed the freezer sitting in the living room. It was a white, standalone deep freezer, the kind people often use to store extra food. It was heavy, so before they tried to move it, they decided to open the lid and see what was inside. When the lid came open, they saw layers of plastic bags stacked and wrapped tightly inside. As one of them started peeling the layers back to clear it out, he froze. Underneath the plastic was a body. It was a teenage girl wrapped tightly in the layers of plastic, frozen solid. Her face was visible through the wrapping, and it was immediately obvious that she had been dead for a long time. The man stepped back, stunned, but something made him look again. Beneath the girl's body, wrapped in a blanket, he could see another smaller form, another child, this one a boy. The crew member ran outside in shock, grabbed his phone, and called 911. Detroit Police Chief James Craig arrived at the apartment complex within an hour of the discovery. By the time he got there, officers had already sealed off the scene and started questioning neighbors. Speaking to reporters outside, Craig said, "It was during that eviction process that they discovered 2 young children in a freezer. They were inside a bag and appeared to be frozen. This is a terrible find. The 2 bodies were so solidly frozen that the medical examiner couldn't even begin autopsies that day. They had to be taken to the morgue and left to thaw on their own, which took 3 full days. While that was happening, detectives worked to identify the children and find where Mitchelle Blair had gone. A neighbor mentioned to police that Blair might be staying with relatives nearby, so officers went to another unit in the same complex and found her there. They took her into custody as a person of interest. When investigators questioned her, Blair didn't try to deny anything. She admitted what she had done straight away. "They're both dead. I did it," she told them. She said the reason she had killed her own children was because they had been sexually abusing her youngest son, and she called them demons. Meanwhile, officers found Gabrielle and Matthew. They were taken to the hospital for medical evaluation and placed under protection. Doctors documented extensive abuse on both of them. Gabrielle's body showed burns from curling irons and clothing irons. One of her front teeth had been broken from being hit in the mouth. Her back had scars from beatings with extension cords and wooden planks, and she still had a fresh cut above her left eye from being struck with a plank. Matthew's back had 25 separate scars and injuries, some old, some newer. The marks matched what came from repeated whippings with extension cords. He also showed other bruises and injuries consistent with being hit. Both children were placed under the care of their maternal great-aunt, Angela Gordon, who had once worked as a child abuse investigator for the Detroit Police Department. She had tried to raise alarms before, but couldn't do much since Blair had cut herself off from most of her family about 2 years earlier. Gordon told authorities that Blair had always been very, very strict with the children. After 3 days, once the bodies had thawed enough for examination, the Wayne County Medical Examiner performed the autopsies. The remains were identified as those of 13-year-old Stoney Ann Blair and 9-year-old Stephen Gage Berry. Both deaths were ruled homicides. Stoney had died from multiple blows to the head, and Stephen had died from a combination of blunt force trauma and severe burns. The medical examiner concluded that Stephen likely died in August of 2012, and Stoney in May of 2013. Their bodies had stayed locked in that freezer for 2 years and 7 months. 2 days later, on March 26, 2015, Blair appeared via video from the Detroit Detention Center for her arraignment before Magistrate Renee McDuffie of the 36th District Court. McDuffie charged her with 5 counts of first-degree child abuse. Bail was set at $1 million, and the court entered a not guilty plea on her behalf. McDuffie stated that the charges in this matter are so heinous. Over the following days, both Gabrielle and Matthew were interviewed at length by child welfare officers and counselors. Gabrielle told them everything in painful detail. She described the 2 weeks her mother tortured Stephen, how she tied a belt around his neck, splashed him with boiling water, and suffocated him with plastic bags. She told them her mother had forced her to put Stoney's body into the freezer, laying it on top of Stephen's. She talked about the years of beatings and burnings she and Matthew endured, and how she'd walked past that freezer every single day, knowing both her brother and sister were inside. Matthew confirmed everything she said. He told counselors he had seen what his mother did, that he knew his brother and sister were dead, and that he had lived in fear afterward. On April 1st, 2015, Wayne County Prosecutor Kim Worthy filed new and far more serious charges. Blair now faced 2 counts of felony murder, 2 counts of first-degree premeditated murder, 2 counts of torture, 4 counts of first-degree child abuse, and 1 count of committing child abuse in the presence of another child. In her public statement, Worthy said, "The alleged facts in this case present examples of why we must all be diligent and involved citizens. A good way to protect society's children is to be alert and look out for your neighborhood youth. Refuse to look the other way. and report what you know when necessary. Even though we are issuing these charges today, this tragic case remains under investigation. Blair was held without bond after that. Her attorney, Wyatt Harris, requested a mental competency evaluation, telling reporters that Blair sometimes struggled to even talk about what had happened. There are times when she can communicate in a very effective manner, he said. Then, there are times when she can't. Mental health professionals later examined her and confirmed that she was competent to stand trial. On June 29, 2015, Mitchelle Blair stood before Wayne County Circuit Judge Dana Hathaway and admitted to killing 2 of her children. She pleaded guilty to first-degree premeditated murder and felony murder. She had been charged with several other crimes, including torture, but the prosecutors agreed to dismiss those lesser charges because the 2 murder convictions already required mandatory life sentences without parole. Before the plea was accepted, Judge Hathaway questioned Blair several times to be sure she understood what she was agreeing to. She said, "I want to make sure you understand this isn't a sentence agreement between you and the people. You are voluntarily admitting to these 2 counts and subjecting yourself to the sentence of life in prison. Is that correct?" Blair said yes. She said she understood. The judge asked her to describe what she had done, and Blair didn't hold back. She explained how in August of 2012, she had walked into the room and caught her youngest son, Matthew, playing with his toys in a sexual way. She said she confronted Stephen, who was 9, and that he had admitted to abusing Matthew. Then, right there in court, she described in detail how she punished him, the scalding water she poured down over his genitals, the Windex she made him swallow, the belt she wrapped around his neck, and the plastic bags she pressed over his face. She told the judge that his death had been accidental, saying she hadn't planned to kill him, even though she knew her actions caused it. Then she described what happened to Stoney. She said that 9 months after Stephen's death, she found out that Stoney had been sexually abusing Matthew too. She said she forced Matthew to admit it after asking him the same question over and over again, and threatening to beat him if he didn't tell the truth. When Matthew finally said yes, Blair said she starved Stoney, beat her, burned her, and in the end strangled her with a t-shirt before suffocating her with a plastic bag. And unlike with her son, she said this time she had fully meant to kill. Blair's voice stayed calm as she spoke. "I don't feel no remorse for the death of them demons," she told the judge. "If I had killed Stephen intentionally, I definitely would be proud to say I did, but I didn't. I don't feel no emotion for the death of them demons." She said they had shown no remorse for what they did to Matthew, and that there was no excuse for rape. She told the court flatly, "I would kill them again." When asked if she had ever called the police about what she claimed happened to her son, Blair said yes, that she had made one call just to ask for advice. She said she had described a hypothetical situation because she didn't want to use her real name. The person on the other end told her that all the children in the home would be taken into custody while the case was investigated. Blair said that after hearing that, she hung up the phone and never gave her name or address. Prosecutor Karen Goldfarb then told the court that there was absolutely no evidence of any sexual abuse. There was evidence that the surviving children were physically abused by this defendant, Goldfarb said, but there was no evidence of rape. Gabrielle had told investigators that there was no concrete evidence that her brother or sister had assaulted Matthew. Counselors who later interviewed Matthew himself said that he had never mentioned being sexually abused. None of the children had seen any doctors or therapists during the time of the alleged abuse because Blair had refused to take them anywhere. The medical examiner's findings matched what Blair described about how the children were killed, and Judge Hathaway accepted her guilty plea. Sentencing was scheduled for July 17th, 2015. When that day came, the courtroom was packed with family members, news reporters, and members of the public. Alexander Dorsey, who was the father of Stoney and Gabrielle, sat quietly near the back. Stephen Barry, the father of Stephen and Matthew, arrived late. Before her sentence was given, Blair was offered the chance to speak. She used the moment to attack both fathers instead of showing remorse. She called Dorsey an alcoholic and a deadbeat, saying neither of them had ever cared for the children and had no right to care now. Judge Hathaway interrupted her. "You imposed the death penalty on your own children," she said firmly. "As a mother, one of your primary responsibilities was to protect your kids. They lived in terrible fear of you, and I find that just so sad in this case. You created a house of horrors." Blair's attorney, Wyatt Harris, told the court that Blair had been abused as a child herself and had very little education. "I'm not making an excuse," he said, "but it didn't allow her to cope with the situation." Prosecutor Goldfarb then stood and spoke about the children. She said Stephen and Stoney had been failed again and again by their mother, by their fathers, and by a system that had investigated abuse twice and still left them in her care. Judge Hathaway sentenced Mitchelle Blair to life in prison without parole. Blair was 36 years old. She showed no emotion as deputies took her from the courtroom, saying, "I haven't lied about anything. As horrendous as everybody think I am, that's fine." After sentencing, Prosecutor Kim Worthy released a statement. "This sentence today brings to a close the tragic and shocking set of circumstances surrounding the very short lives of Stoney Blair and Stephen Barry. There were no winners, only losers. I truly hope these children can finally rest in peace." Blair was transferred to the Huron Valley Correctional Facility in Ypsilanti, Michigan. Within just a few days of arriving, she attacked another inmate and was placed in segregation. She's been kept there ever since. By April of 2019, she had collected 49 disciplinary violations, including for assaulting officers and for throwing feces and urine at staff. Gabrielle and Matthew went to live with their great aunt, Angela Gordon. Both began therapy. Matthew was later adopted, and Gabrielle stayed with Gordon, graduated from high school, and continued on to college. They were the only two who made it out of what their home had become. Stephen and Stoney were buried side by side.